Hi everyone, I'm Stephanie Wilson. I'm a Ph.D. candidate in the Sociology department at Purdue University, and I'm also co-founder of Applied Worldwide. We produce online content for sociologists and students of sociology that explores career options in an applied track rather than an academic track. So if you are a sociology major and you're exploring some of the options for a career after you graduate, and you want to stick with sociology, feel free to check out our free content at appliedworldwide.com. But today what I'm going to talk about is actually my work as a researcher. So as a researcher, my work focuses on health inequalities related to sexual and reproductive health. So some of my current research is exploring the intersections of gender, race, and class, and how that's related to disparities in pelvic pain patient care in the U.S. The research I'm going to talk about with you all today is actually some of my earlier research I conducted as a master's student about genital herpes, stigma, and disclosure to sexual partners. Before I get to the specifics of my research, I just want to go over some of the basics, especially on STI rates in the US. It's something that I like to open up my lectures on this topic with because I find that a lot of folks don't really know how prevalent STIs are in the US. 50% of sexually active adults will contract an STI by the time they turn 25 years old. So that's half of the US population. And these stats are coming from the American Sexual Health Association's 2018 statistics. Another stat from the American Sexual Health Association tells us that there's an estimated 20 million new infections each year. And half of those 20 million new infections occur within the 15 to 24-year-old age group. Here's the kicker. Only 12% of 15 to 24-year-olds were tested for STIs in 2017. And that 20 million stat is from 2018. So often when I share these numbers, people are a little bit shocked that the percentage of STI rates in the US is so high. This is including all STIs, so not just genital herpes. But when we do look at genital herpes in the US, the stats are a little bit less straightforward, primarily because herpes simplex virus, or HSV, is categorized into two types, and that's type 1 and type 2. 1 in 6 Americans between the ages of 14 and 49 test positive for HSV type 2, the type that we typically associate with genital herpes. 1 in 5 men and 1 in 4 women is another stat. They're not completely consistent across sources. When we look at HSV1, that stat skyrockets to 80% of Americans testing positive. HSV1 is typically associated with oral herpes or cold sores, but it can occur both genitally and orally, and it can be transmitted through any skin-to-skin contact, so that includes oral sex. That stat doesn't mean that 80% of the US population has genital herpes, but it does mean that they have the capability of giving a sexual partner genital herpes. So that's a lot of people. And I share these stats when I talk about my research because I think it's really important to contextualize our discussions on stigma as it relates to STIs with these statistics, because it may be a little shocking to folks that if 80% of the country is, having this experience of testing positive for herpes in some way, why is it so stigmatized, right? And so that's something I encourage you to think about as I'm sharing some of my research. It's also important to note, even with these high stats for herpes, the CDC reports that most people who have herpes don't actually know it. So there's lots of asymptomatic carriers of this virus. It really becomes this interesting case for studying stigma as this socially constructed concept because, again, so many people have it that when you really look at the numbers, it's surprising that it's so stigmatized. And stigma as a concept, it's something that everyday folks can talk about, and we all kind of generally understand what stigma means. But because of that, it's really important to make sure that we're really grounding our sociological discussions on stigma in the sociology literature. So many of you have probably heard of Erving Goffman before. He was the first sociologist to bring stigma into the academic sociological literature. And in doing so, he defined stigma as an attribute that is deeply discrediting. But he also emphasized that it should be seen that a language of relationships and not attributes is needed. And how sociologists have interpreted what he means by this is that in order to understand stigma, we have to look at the surrounding social context, and that includes our relationships and our interactions, and not just our interactions with other people, but our interactions with organizations and our interactions with social institutions. If we look at some of the research, we actually see that the psychological and emotional and social consequences of a positive herpes test are a lot greater than the physical symptoms that most people deal with. So that again emphasizes this language of relationships in that it has such a emotional toll on people because of those relationships, because of those interactions, not necessarily because of what herpes is as a virus biologically, right? So Goffman was the first one to sort of bring stigma into the sociological discourse, but many other people have sort of built on his ideas. It's such a big concept. There's been sort of an attempt to break it down a little bit in order to better understand it, be better able to measure it, and sort of pinpoint it in our research. So Jones and colleagues were some of those folks who expanded on these ideas around stigma, and they came up with 6 dimensions of stigma to sort of help break up this giant concept of stigma into these 6 different dimensions to understand sort of the different factors that impact stigmatization of different attributes. Those 6 dimensions include concealability, so is it visible or can you conceal it? Course is the second dimension, so is it acute, chronic, what's the ultimate outcome? The third dimension is disruptiveness, and this one asks, to what extent does it disrupt our interactions, communication, and relationships? The fourth dimension is aesthetic qualities. So to what extent does it make the possessor of that attribute repellent or ugly? And the fifth dimension is origin. So under what circumstances did the condition occur? And then the sixth dimension is peril. Is it contagious? Is it dangerous? What is the threat of this attribute to the greater society? When we apply these to herpes, we can think of, okay, concealability. It's generally concealable, but there's pressure to disclose in specific situations. Of course, it's chronic, it's not curable, it's, in medical terms, manageable, right? But it's not life-threatening. Disruptiveness, it's certainly disruptive to dating, sexual encounters, and even sometimes platonic interactions. Aesthetic qualities, we use this language of clean and dirty, and it sort of deems a person unattractive to have a positive STI status in a lot of ways. Origin most likely occurred during a sexual encounter. With who may impact the degree of the stigma. So was it a spouse? Was it a longtime partner? Was it a one-night stand? And then peril. So being a transmissible disease certainly adds to the stigma through this dimension of peril. Not necessarily just through it being a transmissible virus, but also the idea of being able to transmit that stigma onto another person. As I said, there's been lots of folks who have built on Goffman's sociological ideas on stigma. One of those people is Graham Scambler. He's a British sociologist who is somewhat well known for his work on health-related stigma specifically. So he and a co-author founded these concepts to sort of, again, give us a more specific idea of these different sort of experiences of this broad concept of stigma. This first one is felt stigma, which is defined as experiencing a fear of enacted stigma and feelings of shame. And that's where enacted stigma, also a Scambler term, refers to stigma-based discrimination. So in the case of herpes, this might be rejection upon disclosure, or perhaps herpes jokes that your friends are making around you and they don't know your status, but it's still hurtful. And shame, although I'm using it in a very specific way for this research, it's one of those words that I'm sure everybody has their own sort of understanding of what shame is. You've probably felt it at some point in your life, right? But for the purpose of this research, I define it academically as this social emotion that results from a tension between societal expectations of us and our own expectations for ourselves. If you're familiar with the concept of the looking glass self, which is basically the idea that I am who I think you think I am. So this idea that how we think others view us really impacts the way that we self-identify. And shame occurs when there's sort of a tension between that part of our identity that's based on how we think others view us and a part of ourselves internally that we sort of feel is true to our core. The last concept that I want to go over briefly is resiliency. I define resilience as this ability to overcome enacted stigma, so that stigma-based discrimination, and feel neutral in situations of that discrimination or rejection. As I mentioned, my research focuses on the disclosure process for folks with genital herpes. So we know from the research that stigma hinders the ability to disclose whatever that attribute is. Maybe it's disclosing a sexual orientation, a gender non-conforming gender identity, or in this case, disclosing a positive STI diagnosis. What we don't know from the research is necessarily how or why stigma hinders disclosure. And so I felt that was an important question to ask, because it's really hard to really do anything or intervene when we don't know the answer to those how or why questions. And then I'm also asking, well, what about those people who are able to overcome the stigma and successfully disclose and, feel confident in their sexuality despite this positive diagnosis? So those are the two questions I'm answering with my research. How and why does stigma hinder disclosure? And how are some individuals able to overcome stigma to successfully disclose? To answer those questions, I conducted qualitative interviews with 27 adults diagnosed with genital herpes. 11 of them were men, 18 were women, and importantly, this data was collected in 2015 and 2016. Participants were 25 to 55 years old in age, and their age of diagnosis ranged from 19 to 51. The majority were white. I had 3 Latino participants and 1 Black participant. I also conducted participant observation at a local herpes support group, and that included 3 hours of data collection across 2 hour-and-a-half long meetings. To give you some context, this was a sort of anonymous gathering of folks with genital herpes who wanted support in the area and could sort of come together. And I think it's important to tell you all too that I was able to attend these meetings because I've been diagnosed with herpes. It gave me the ability to sort of attend these meetings as an insider. On to my findings, the fun part. So my findings are encompassed in this model that depicts a pathway to successful disclosure. And so when I'm talking about successful disclosure, it's defined as successful by the person giving that disclosure, right? So they walk away from it feeling successful. And so it doesn't necessarily mean that they weren't rejected. It doesn't mean that the relationship continued on after disclosure, but it means that that person who gave the disclosure felt that that was a successful experience for them. So it all starts at the top of the model here with being labeled with a genital herpes diagnosis. And everybody that I interviewed went through the process of step 1 in this model, which was this internalization of peril. And so a lot of folks talked about literally feeling like they were a risk to potential partners, with one participant telling me, I'm scared I have this weird full body herpes that is going to take over the universe and I can't touch anyone. And another participant told me I just felt like I was this walking biohazard. So this idea that I myself am a threat, it's internalizing this threat of the virus to your identity as a person, right? They all seem to move towards this second step in the model as well. That was sort of an inevitable step for everyone of experiencing felt stigma, which again we talked about as feelings of shame and a fear of enacted stigma. And so at this point, people have internalized the peril and so internalized that stigma in some sense, right? With an emphasis on this like transmissibility. And they've started to experience these feelings of shame and this fear of enacted stigma because of that internalization. So one participant told me, the worst thing that could happen during or after disclosure is somebody telling me that I'm disgusting or thinking that I was sleeping around and that's why I got it. When you think somebody has herpes, you think that person was a slut and they were sleeping around and that's how they get it, and that's not right. So I'm afraid that somebody is going to tell me that I'm gross or be really, really mean to me. I'm really afraid. So you can see here that Sarah was saying very blatantly, I'm afraid, I have this fear of rejection, and not just rejection, but somebody being really, really mean to her because of this one thing, right? You can see shame shining through here as well in this idea that you think somebody with herpes is a slut, right? She's saying that's not me, but this is what society is putting on me with this label, and it's resulting in these feelings of shame for her, and those two things combined is what felt stigma is. And so at this step, the participants were either going towards what I call avoidance purgatory here, or alternatively, folks started going down this pathway to successful disclosure. But for those who ended up sort of staying in this avoidance purgatory, they moved on to this step 3A. It's this place of avoiding disclosure. And Regina sort of exemplifies this when she told me the thought of having to tell someone else is just, it's enough to make me do practically anything to stay with my boyfriend, so I don't have to tell multiple people. It's almost like I'll put up with a lot more crap and people don't understand why, and I'm not going to tell them why. It's about having to find somebody that you can trust and that you can tell, and they're going to be all right with the diagnosis. There are a lot of people that are not going to be all right with herpes. She's avoiding having to put herself in the position of having to disclose to somebody, and in that way is sort of stuck in this avoidance purgatory. Alternatively, as I said, there were many folks who instead were able to find social support that helped them move through the pathway to successful disclosure, starting with step 3B, where they overcome shame and improve their self-concept. One participant, Katie, demonstrates this step, and she told me, having so soon after my diagnosis found people that have herpes is like you would never think twice, especially the guy who runs this website. I think he's super attractive and he's just an awesome guy. I was just like, okay, well maybe this isn't such a big deal. And we can see Victoria here sharing a quote that really shows how she was able to improve her self-concept when she said, I now believe that I am lovable, that this is not a life sentence, that I am not dirty, that it is a condition of health, and that I understand it. I think I just feel lighter, and because of that I feel more centered and more back into the truest version of me. You know, I'm a big deal. Like, I have something to share with somebody. I'm interesting, and I think I'm attractive, and I'm intelligent and well-rounded and kind and loving, and you know, I deserve to be loved. So here Victoria and Katie were able to overcome that shame and improve that self-concept because of social support that they received, either by attending support groups where they were able to meet other people with herpes who showed them that I don't have to fit into this stereotype that society tells me I am this because of this diagnosis. And in doing that, they were able to improve their self-concept. Another way people found that social support was through disclosing to friends or family members who they were sure would accept them. After being able to overcome that shame and improve one's self-concept because of that, folks moved on to this step 4, where they were able to find resilience to enacted stigma, which in a lot of cases was rejection or even herpes jokes in the workplace, in gatherings with friends or family. One participant, Allison, really shows this when she told me people either accept it or they don't accept it, and if people can't accept it, then they're not in my life in an intimate manner. And Allison here is really showing that yeah, some people are going to reject me and it's not going to bother me. I can feel neutral to that. I've built up this resilience to that enacted stigma with the help of social support by overcoming shame and improving my self-concept. And the last step here is where folks reach that final step of successful disclosure. And my favorite quote to share to demonstrate this step comes from Ashley, who, if you remember, she was the one who told us that she felt like she had this weird full body herpes, right? And so she's been through this entire pathway to end up at this step 5. And this was the story of the first time she really felt she was successful in this disclosure process. And she told me very quickly it came out, and I just said, I've had herpes for like 17 years. And mind you, this is 17 years after her diagnosis she reached this step, right? But he was so appreciative that I said it. But he was like, I feel so bad for you. I feel so sorry for you. How horrible, what a horrible thing you have to live with. And I was like, actually, it's just part of my life. I felt really neutral. I felt like he was trying to put something on me. But I knew I'd gotten to a different place. He was trying to put this whole trip on me, like, oh my God, you're so untouchable, and just this horrible shame. And I was like, actually, this is part of what it is to have my body, and this is not keeping me from having my full life at all. It felt like a triumph for me. So you can see here, she's really walking us through this enacted stigma that she had to face. He was trying to put this shame on her, and she was in a different place now. She had found that resilience, and she was able to have a successful experience disclosing despite the enacted stigma she was facing. So as an applied sociologist, I always challenge myself to think about how my research matters outside of the academic journal that it hopefully eventually ends up in, right? I find it really helpful to think about it in how does it apply potentially to our various social institutions. And the example of education here, I think, is the most straightforward. So our educational institutions, how can this research be applied in a way that sort of improves the well-being of society and those who live in it? If we think about these findings a little bit more in terms of how they translate to real life, right? It's telling us that social support is really important for folks in getting them to feel comfortable and confident disclosing their sexual health status to partners. So many folks end up with a positive STI diagnosis in their life at some point, right? Half of people who are sexually active in the US will be diagnosed with an STI by the time they're 25. Half of us are going to have to deal with a positive STI diagnosis, but we don't learn how to deal with that positive STI diagnosis, right? What we learn in sex education is how to avoid that diagnosis. But what the statistics tell us is, in a lot of ways, STIs are an inevitable part of being a sexually active adult. So what we should be doing in our sex education curriculum is sharing with people how they can access support when they do receive that positive diagnosis. That's one way it can be applied to our educational institutions. And what my research is really showing is sort of how people successfully deal with that diagnosis. And social support, seeking out social support, is a huge part of dealing with that diagnosis and finding success at the end of it. I hope you all enjoyed learning about my research, and I also hope you learned something about STI rates in the US, and that if you haven't had your own experience with a positive STI test, hopefully you think a little bit differently about those who have and the stigma that impacts their lives, and how you can be a part of sort of diminishing that stigma and changing the narratives around STIs. Don't forget to check out appliedworldwide.com. We have a directory of profiles of applied and clinical sociologists. So these are all sociologists working with organizations, communities, and different groups of people using their sociological knowledge and skills to improve the well-being of society. And it's really awesome, so I hope you all go check it out and learn something from that as well. Thank you for listening, and have a great day.